Good day, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on yet another episode of the podcast. Today, I have Mr. Jonathan Stead. He is the Vice President, Technical Expertise with AGRA, and which is a leading non-for-profit organization dedicated to driving agricultural, economic, and food system transformation across the African continent. In his role, Mr. Jonathan brings a wealth of expertise in building strategic partnerships between the African government and pioneering private public sectors actors. His work focuses on fostering collaboration, drive large-scale economic transformation, job creation, and poverty reduction. Mr. Jonathan has extensive experience in shaping policies and implementing protocol solutions. He has been in the forefront of efforts and positioned Africa agriculture not just as a means of sustenance, but also as a powerful engine for economic growth and sustainable development. He is the guest on the podcast today. So, Mr. Jonathan, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. Nice to be here.
Fantastic. So we'll just delve into the conversation. My very first question to you today is you have a lot of extensive experience working with different African governments and even the private sector. So, from your perspective, why is agriculture still central to Africa's economic transformation?
I think the key thing is that, first thing to say is it's not just about agriculture. So we like to think of also the manufacturing and services parts of it. So we talk now about food systems, even though it's not just about the food sector, because from agriculture you also get many non-food products, right? If you think about soaps, you think about clothes, you think about even toys, even brake fluids and things like that. Many industrial goods come from the ag sector, and the services sector a lot ultimately depends on tangible things, whether it's agriculture or manufacturing or something like mining. And so the sector, and when I say the sector, I'm talking holistically, not just the farming part, so to speak, is critical because there has never been any continent in the world that has really allowed its people to prosper, flourish, thrive, to grow their economies, to become, high income or upper middle or high income countries without the agriculture and food and agro processing sector transforming and growing in a highly productive way. And that's because many people depend either directly or indirectly on either their livelihoods from the sector, or they depend on the sector for consumption, right? For not whether, of course, food is the most obvious, but the other various areas as well. And other more advanced sectors, as I said, also depend on it being productive. Being able to take those goods that come from the soils, from the land, and transforming them into higher value products and delivering higher value services based around also those goods. And so the sector is fundamental. You can't have wider economic and therefore also social transformation without it transforming as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that and just giving us much more insight on that. So my next question to you at this time is: what are some of the most effective agricultural policies you have seen the African government implement that sort of directly contribute to job creation and even poverty reduction?
So the most transformative policies are what are called basically industrial policy. Now, when we say the word industrial policy, many people either confuse it with manufacturing, but that's not what it means, or they confuse it with doing things in a non-sustainable and non-environmentally friendly way, but that's also not what it means. So industrial policy, what industrial policy basically means is where you are from the government side, you are able to coordinate and collaborate with. You're able to get different ministries and therefore different policies. So if you think of, for example, tax policy, land policy, energy
Mm-hmm.
policy, fertilizer policy, extension policy, and so on and so forth, there are many policies, and these various policies sit in different parts of government, different ministries, different departments. Um, and so, but agriculture transformation and agro processing depend on the private sector, not on government, right? But the private sector
True.
require these things to be in place, right? They need to access seed, and they need to access fertilizer, and they need water, and they need roads, and they need rural electrification, and they need access to markets and access to finance. Um, but on the government side now, unless the government adopts at the highest level of government, whether it's at state level or national, federal level, at the highest level, this agri-industrial policy, they are really unable to coordinate these different policies, energy, fertilizer, access to finance, seeds, land, etc., around the needs of the private sector. And when we say private sector, we're including farmers, smallholder farmers, medium and large. We're including aggregators. We're including, transport companies. We're including seed and fertilizer companies, agro dealers, all of those. So key thing is when you're able to bring the two together, the sort of more pioneering, dynamic private sector on the one hand, and also the government and public, not just government, because you also have other, public non-state actors like research and so on. When you're able to bring the two together to focus and to problem solve around the most, we call them binding constraints, right? The biggest, most pressing challenges that are undermining the ability of the sector to transform. So industrial policy, and so sometimes we say agro-industrialization, basically just means the ability of the government to engage and multiple ministries, right? Not just the Ministry of Agriculture, because you need finance, you need ministries of trade and industry, ministries of land, infrastructure, and so youth, education, etc. How do they coordinate around the needs of the private sector in specific value chains, but also cross-cutting enabler sectors like seed, mechanization, fertilizer, so that there is a growth of investment by the private actors in a way that flourishes. But so the biggest gap that we've had on this continent is actually the absence of such industrial policy. And of course, we then talk about green industrial policies, which makes sure that you are applying them in a way that is environmentally sustainable, taking care of soil health, taking care of water, taking care of biodiversity, landscapes, etc.
Wow. Thank you so much for expatiating on that. So at this point, my next question to you would definitely just be around um, collaboration, right? So what would you say, how can partnering private sector actors collaborate more meaningfully with the government to sort of accelerate the agricultural growth and food system transformation?
I think the key thing is with the private sector, there's different types of private sector, and I think it's important to start from there. There's private sector that is, and I'm not just talking about size of business, SMEs and large, local, multinational. What I'm talking about is more that you have some private sector that are happy with the status quo because they're making money with the current situation. They're able to, call the governor or call the minister and ask for a favor, and they get it. And they might be an oligopoly, they might be a monopoly, they might be in a cartel doing price fixing. They might be speculating off the back of smallholder farmers, etc. And then you have private sector who are actually, through their business model, the way they're actually making money is in a way that is, they have a vested interest in the value chain as a whole growing, other businesses growing. They have a vested interest in co-learning. They have vested interest in smallholder farmers increasing their productivity. They have a vested interest in a better enabling environment, So I think you have to start by distinguishing between those two. And then you have some businesses that are between. But those are two important poles. And then and whether they are domestic or, of course, the most important is domestic by far, but you may also have international businesses too in either category. So then what becomes more important is the group that are more, we call them anchor firms, or pioneer firms, the ones that are most progressive in really wanting to see the value chain and working, and smallholder farmers increase productivity. They're creating jobs, they're innovating, they're discovering whether the country or the state can really compete with imports on that, or even in an export market with the other global competitors. Those guys are the ones that you want to identify first.
Okay.
And then the second level is the same in government. In government, you also have people. Sometimes we tend to brush off government as, just one,
Yeah.
oh, they're all, corrupt, and they're all this and that, and waste of
Yeah.
time. But that's not the reality. The reality is that within government, just like in the private sector, you have the two
Yeah.
poles. You have groups. You have people for the state. So for the government, it's more about power, of course, money as well.
True.
But power. So you have people that are happy with the status quo because they have power with the current rules of the game. But you also have many people who are progressives, who are visionaries and really want to, and they work hard to move forward their state or their district or their country. And so you also want to identify them. And then the key thing is how you bring the progressives on the private sector side and the progressives on the government side together around a common agenda. And that could be a specific value chain, or a specific, cross-cutting sector, or a specific region even, and then problem solve together. But they have to have a common shared agenda.
I like how you put it. They have to be like a common vested interest, and then solving a specific challenge. Fantastic, fantastic. So, with Africa's rapidly growing youth population, what would you say are some of like the opportunities that exist within agriculture and the food system, just beyond farming, that can create like sustainable jobs for our young teen population?
There's a lot that is beyond farming. So two dimensions. First, good to start with the value chain. The value chain actually starts before the farm, right? So it starts with inputs, starts with seed, right? That has to be researched. So there's lots of space for youths.
Yeah.
There are nurseries for small seedlings for trees, tree crops, etc. And same for agro dealerships, same for fertilizer or other inputs, inoculant and things like that. So there's a lot of space there. Of course, then there's the on-farm, but then after the farm, then you have the aggregation, you have the harvest, you have storage, you have village level processing. So early stage processing, like drying and things like that. And then you have more advanced processing as well into more packaged goods. There's obviously packaging. And then, so that's along the value chain. There's also, export development and things like that. Marketing, all those things, penetrating key target markets, even, within the country, the big urban centers, into supermarkets and all of that. That's along the value chain. And then in parallel to the value chain, you have key enablers, so services like organizational services or digital services. Or even business development services. A lot of those businesses in the value chain struggle with, proper business planning. They struggle with sometimes legal services. Sometimes they may struggle with marketing. They don't have marketing skills, or sometimes they don't have, audit support, and so on and so forth, or some specific technical expertise. They may be missing around breeding or around soil science or something. So you have a whole set also that are services going in to the transport services, and others like that will also be included. Then you have electrification services for rural electricity provision, whether it's managing water pumps, for example, for micro irrigation, or whether it is even for storage, cold chain, cold storage.
Yeah.
So there's a whole set of work and job opportunities within. Then once actually, I would then go one step level, going back to the value chain. on the processing side, what we tend to look at is it's not just about the crop or the livestock, the animal. It's more about how many products you can get
Yes.
from that
From each
product.
of
So
them. Yeah.
yeah, so soybean is an example. That's why some crops actually are less good for this. So for example, tea. If you're growing
Mm.
tea, for example, or even maybe coffee, there's typically one product that you get from, right? The drink.
True.
Maybe there's a bit
True.
of products, but in terms of commercial big market. But if you're talking soybean, for example, you've got the oil, you've got the feed, you've got the lecithin, you've got the soy milk, you've got the soy sauce, you've got so many products that you can
Yeah.
be, manufacturing that, and then each of those will then generate their own work opportunities and jobs as well. So I think you also have to look at it in terms of it's called the product space. So how many products can you get from that crop or that animal? Like the same with the cow, right? If you're doing livestock, like cows, you can have the milk, you have the meat, but even you have the leather industry and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much for expatiating on a lot on that, just starting out from even pre-farming and then just, highlighting so much of the opportunities that are within the value chain. Thank you for sharing that. Another vital part as regards agriculture, even in this dispensation, has to be a lot to do around digital agriculture and even precision agriculture, right? So with digital agriculture and agri-tech, they're gaining momentum across Africa. How do you sort of see technology driving both productivity and economic inclusivity?
Productivity and inclusivity. So productivity, I think it's mostly about so technology, agri-tech, and also other related areas, fintech and so on, energy tech and all those things. Even ed tech, right? Education technologies that are being used in schools, because one of the key areas of agriculture is actually advisory, like extension services, advising farmers on how to better manage their farm, get better inputs, etc. And one of the models that works is actually doing that through schools. So there are all these solutions out there, and my organization AGRA recently did a bit of an assessment. There's over about 500 companies providing digital tech solutions in the ag space in Africa.
Wow.
And that was last year. I suspect it's probably higher than that now. So there's no shortage of solutions, from drones to you name it.
Yeah.
But the issue is more about, that's the supply side. The issue is more about the demand side, and how do you ensure that those technologies are
Adopted.
relevant, adopted. So they have to be relevant, affordable, accessible, and then the accessibility and the affordable and accessibility point are important for your point around inclusion, because if it's
Yeah.
only the richest 5% of farmers who can afford that technology, then they will obviously use it. And we're seeing a lot of that. There's many clusters around the continent where you have the more richer medium to large scale farms they're using a lot of technologies, from self-driving smart tractors to drones to you name it, is being used. But your typical farmer in the village doesn't have access to that. So how do you ensure that it's affordable, cost effective, such that the cost for smallholder farmers to invest in that technology is lower than the benefit they will get, the tangible benefit in terms of profitability of their farm or of their business. And that's still where, while you have all these solutions on the supply side, ultimately you have to look at the demand and so one of the best lessons that we've seen from other continents, if you look at Brazil, if you look at Vietnam, various countries, Turkey and so on, even the United States and European countries, is where the technology is not just off the shelf or what is driven by the tech sector. That's okay when you get some degree of adoption, but it won't really have a huge impact. What will have more impact is when you take a problem-solving lens and you say, okay, what is the biggest problem you as a wheat farmer in Zambia, for example, smallholder farmer, are facing? Is it a pest? Is it that your crop is falling over? Is it drought resistance? What is it? Is it a storage issue because of, is it aflatoxin or whatever it is? And then how do we, in your context locally, find a solution that works for you? So when you flip it around and you're much more solution and problem and solution centered, as opposed to an off-the-shelf thing, then it tends to work better also for both productivity and inclusion. And that's why also the importance of public investment in technology is also important, but also the private sector also really exploring low cost and demand based solutions. So a lot of those firms I mentioned that are providing tech solutions, a lot of them go out of business or will go out of business, right? Because they might have a nice technology, but it's not commercially viable at scale, and so they should go out of business. But so the ones that make it are the ones that you should be able to sell your commodity, your product, because there's a clear tangible value for the businesses, the farmers or the SMEs or the businesses in the value chain.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. But I would want to think of it that sometimes the cost of creating the solution some sort of impacts how much the creators of the solution can then sell the solution for or sell the service for, right? In most cases, and probably that's why it's expensive. Because I was having an interview session with the founder of a company, a biotech company in Barbados, and it was talking. They're into like turning waste to to like usable products, turning waste to like microbiome stuff that can be used for soil nutrients and soil fertility. And he was saying that one of the challenges that they have is adoption. Not adoption in terms of the farmers don't want it, but it's just like in terms of like the pricing of acquiring, their service. And
Yeah.
personally, I would want to think about it that that's like probably where the investments of like maybe the government in terms of like policies or even grants and things like that would be helpful in such cases to provide those solutions to rural farmers, or even setting up like clusters where they could access those services. Like a huge number of farmers could be in a cluster, and then that service or that machine or that is then provided for them to access. What would be your take on that?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a case for public investment, whether that is government, whether that is from the aid community, whether that is even local non-state actors, charity, local NGOs, charities.
Yeah.
There's always a case for public investment. However, if you want that public investment to really succeed, because there's been many public investments that have failed, right, in such areas,
Yeah.
then you have to make sure there's still a commercial business case, such that you can subsidize a certain technology to increase adoption and so on, but that technology still has to ultimately stand on its own 2 feet. So it has to have the basis to stand on its own 2 feet. You're right that so and often the problem has been that sometimes the public effort, including the development community, the aid community, etc., is they didn't start from that business case. They kind of started from the assumption, oh, this is a great technology, it works in the lab, or it worked in Mexico or somewhere, and so we should try it, find it here. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's commercially viable. So they often make that mistake. And so, yes, you should do it, but let's start from the commercial business case and understand the metrics of, okay, this technology costs, $2 per whatever. The farmer readiness to buy it is $1.60. So if we subsidize that 40 cents for 3 or 4 years, we think that we can get to a point where farmers will be ready to pay that the $2 for it, because they'll really be seeing the impact on their yields and their income, right? So that's the approach. But often that analysis I find is not well done. The other thing is that with technologies, they're not blankets. They tend to work in specific I mean, some are a bit more blanket, like things like drones and so on. But even in there, often it depends on the context, both geography, so things
Yeah.
like the soils, the types of crops, but also the value chain, because the value chain, if the value chain has a farm gate price which is here, there's much more space to invest. If the farm gate price is down here or it's highly volatile, one year it's good, and the other one it collapses, the price collapses, and then there's a drought and so on. Then farmers are very, and not just farmers, but even other businesses in the chain are going to be very they are risk averse for many fair reasons. And so they're not going to want to invest. Yes, it's a nice to have, but it's too risky for me to invest in it in my business. And so you have to be able to go to the context, and typically by value chain, right? Because it's one thing if you're doing, high value pineapple, and it's another if you're doing low value maize. They're very the metric, the economics of the two are very different, and they vary by country and subnationally. So then, based on that, you can then say, yes, there are some bases where we can agglomerate, as you were saying, if there's an investment in an agro park or an agro zone, agro pole, or something like that, or you can invest through anchor farms, for example. So these might be medium, not just farms, but they could also be other types of anchor businesses. They could be like a seed or fertilizer companies or industry, or even processors that have that incentive to invest in farming and the value chain as a whole. And you can invest through them because they have existing capability, extension, knowledge, expertise, etc., network of farmers, of agro dealers, off takers, and so on. That you can bed that costing into that model, and they can then disperse it and do the awareness, do the trainings, do the adoption. So you have to find also the context-specific mechanism for distribution of that technology.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. So we have two more questions, and we are done with this session today. So my next question is around transformation within the food system. Transforming food system is it's a complex challenge, particularly within the African context. So what would you say are like some of the structural changes that you believe are most critical for Africa to unlock prosperity through agriculture?
I think the first thing really is, in terms of structural changes, is it's kind of what I was alluding to before. Is basically the need for starting with governments, and then also those pioneering private sector. And good to think of them through associations, which tend to work better by value chain or by cross-cutting enabler sector, seed industry and so on. But where the government and then that private sector are able to really see the benefit of the industrial policy approach, basically public-private coming together to problem solve. That's the fundamental thing. And below that, what we have been seeing is that the international community, in my view, has also made this much harder for various reasons, geopolitical reasons, because a lot of the geopolitical engagement is still extractive. So it doesn't promote that collaboration to invest in local value chains and value addition. Also because of the aid community, likewise, has shunned this, and even the global economic architecture, the IMF, the World Bank, etc., they've all shunned this approach. And so you just end up with private sector underinvesting, and the right private sector, the more progressive one, underinvesting, and the wrong private sector capturing more of the rents and so on. So it requires an understanding that the biggest driver is the political economy. So this relationship between these types of actors, and whether they come together to find local solutions, and then being able to channel that support to those local efforts, where they may need also some more international-based resources. So that's fundamentally is the issue. But the biggest driver is going to come from the local private sector and the local government, the two progressives being able to coordinate, organize, and address through collective action, address problems. Now, that's the fundamental big thing. Then, of course, below that, you can talk about some big issues. You have issues of soil health, you have issues of seed
Yeah.
yields. You have an uptake of certified yields. You have issues around water management. You have issues of taxes of agro processors. You have issues of competition issues between and linkages between farmers and off-takers and processors. You have issues of access to finance and the high cost of finance. Of course, you have issues of rural electricity cost. So you have many issues, and you can end up with a long list. Yes, we can say which are the most important, probably issues to do with water management, issues to do with extension services, issues to do with seed and fertilizer access, issues to do with this farmer off-taker, agro processor farmer relationship, trust issues between the
Mm-hmm.
two. Also, the link between research, extension, and farmers, which I alluded to before,
Yeah.
in full. So there are some of these big things, yes, but to really get also traction on those, the bigger point is this industrial policy piece, which many people don't like talking about, but it is actually the most important.
So why do you think people don't like talking about the industrial policy piece?
Well, for the reasons I alluded to before. So some people think that it's not environmentally friendly. So it leads to, that it leads to just a few benefiting and not the majority, or it leads to environmental degradation, which is not, and that's not what it means. You can have good industrial policy or bad, but you have to use it as a tool. It's like saying, oh, we don't want to do education policy because only the top 10 people are benefiting. Point is, you need to have an education policy which is inclusive, and in the same way here. And then secondly, I think is that historically there's also been from many of the more advanced nations, they used it themselves to develop and to gain economic power globally. And so they kind of have a bit of an interest to keep it that way. And so they want to downplay it for the less developed nations. I think that's a very well documented and situation that we have in the global geopolitical space. I think the development community also has not engaged it for similar reasons as a result of both these two concerns, let's say the environment and equity issue, and also the global geopolitical issue.
Fantastic. Anyways, thank you so much for giving us much more insights on that. And this would be like the final question for today. If you could give a call to action to young Africans and other policymakers, what would that be? What would that call to action be? Two people. First, young people and policymakers. Then also, what would they be in order to ensure agriculture delivers prosperity for the continent? So what would that be? To just ensure that agriculture delivers
So
prosperity.
sure. I think the call to action is basically to, if you're into business, either as a business owner in the agro processing space, it also extends to other highly productive sectors, manufacturing, tradable services, etc. If you're in that space, you need to, as an employer or business owner or an employee, you could be an employee, of course, as well. And most people will be employees. Not everyone can be a business owner. Then you have to, invest in your business properly, like really try to succeed and get the business to stand on its own 2 feet. But at the same time, is don't stay away from government. That's the biggest thing. Government is not big bad. Government is actually a representation of mostly the private sector, to be honest, because it's often so. Engage the private sector constructively and understand which parts of government can you work with to do those problem solvings. And the same if you're in government, right? If you're a government and you're a progressive, really trying to move things forward, build bridges with the private sector to come together. You come from different angles, but the mistrust that we have between the two just leads to the people that benefit from the status quo on both sides benefiting, and then the actual transformation that you're alluding to not happening. So for me, that's the most critical, because get your business right or get your government departments right, but on top of that, you have to work with each other around specific problems. I think that for me is by far the biggest call to action, that because we're seeing much more dynamism, people are investing and so on and so forth, but it just has to go faster, and we need to see more of it. We need to see more cross learning also between SMEs, between private actors. Like, don't, the
Yeah.
pie is big. You don't need to keep your technology for yourself, right? I recently
Mm,
met a lady who set up a seed company in Zambia, and she was saying, I mean, Zambia alone is huge, right? I can't, as a SME with 20 people, cover all of Zambia on, early generation seed. So she's encouraging others to join the sector and sharing learnings, and they share resources and they share technologies and so on. And they're now looking at, okay, maybe we can also start exporting to Angola and to other places where they have demand. So that mentality of cross industry, cross SME or cross business learning, to really drive the sector as a whole, is really, really important, rather than thinking about, my small size of the pie and how I capture a bigger size of a very small pie. Point is, let's grow the pie for everyone.
mm, mm. Okay, okay, fine. So, what would be your call to action to young people to participate within the food system sector?
So, well, it depends what your calling is. You have to do something that excites you, otherwise you'll run out of steam. So if you're more of a public person, working government, we need to keep strengthening governments. Governments are critical. If you're
Yeah.
more public sector oriented, um, um, as opposed to working for some international NGO that can leave tomorrow and doesn't leave anything sustainable. So work for local institutions like government, or local research if you're more of a research person, university or so on, around this problem solving, local problem solving I mentioned. And if you're
Yeah.
more of a private sector oriented person, then run, either set up or run or support an existing business that is pioneering, but be a good actor, right, in the space. Really be a pioneer firm, an anchor firm, as opposed to an oligopolist or a cartel or a speculator or an extractive, where you're not really adding value, you're just capturing rents from
Mhm.
market, and that just keeps farmers and the entire sector down. So really, it's about being good actors, whichever part of whether you're public or private, and collaborating between the two. That's really my call to action.
Mm. Thank you so much, Mr. Jonathan. It's been such an insightful interaction with you today. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your expertise with us and the audience today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to speak with you.
Likewise. Do have a lovely day.
You too. You too. Take care.